The Vel'shara did not ask for help. Not once in 400 years of recorded history had the Vel'shara transmitted an open-frequency distress signal into the wider galaxy. Their philosophers had a word for it, kethvorum, which translated, roughly, into the shame of an exposed root. To show your weakness to the universe was to invite the universe to step on you. But Elder Counselor Darasen had watched her people die for 6 months straight, and she had run out of philosophy. The Vel'shara homeworld, Shinvara, was a planet of smooth stone and deep ocean. Their cities were not built on land. They were suspended beneath the surface of their seas, anchored to thermal vents that had powered their civilization for 3 millennia. Their structures were made of a living coral-like organism called Veth, which grew and reshaped itself in response to electrical signals. Their buildings breathed. Their bridges remembered the weight of every foot that crossed them. Their world was alive in a way that most species would never understand, and the Vel'shara loved it with a quietness that didn't need words. Then the Drekhale came. The Drekhale was not an empire. They were not a military force. They were, in the most precise language available, a consuming system, a self-replicating network of biomechanical organisms that had long ago lost the distinction between hunger and purpose. They did not conquer. They absorbed. They arrived at a planet's edge and simply began, slowly and methodically, converting whatever they touched into more of themselves, thereby expanding their own civilization and influence over the newly encountered world. They had been drifting through the outer spiral of the galaxy for 60 years, absorbing 3 smaller civilizations before they reached the Shinvara system. The Vel'shara had known they were coming. They had built barriers, electric field emitters, and acoustic disruption nets. They had collapsed tunnels, sealed cities, and flooded corridors. None of it worked for long. The Drekhale simply grew around the obstacles, learned the frequency of the disruptions, and adapted within 48 hours of each new defense. By the time Darasen sent the signal, the Western Ocean, the oldest, most sacred body of water on Shinvara, the one the Vel'shara called Vel'math, meaning the place where we first remembered ourselves, was 40% absorbed. The city of Oranchal, population 1.2 million, had gone silent 17 days ago. The signal was simple. Vel'shara communication was tonal, built on overlapping frequencies that conveyed meaning through harmony rather than sequence. The distress signal translated, when run through a standard galactic converter, as, "We are a people who did not ask. We are asking now. We do not know the cost. We are asking anyway." It was the most vulnerable thing any Vel'shara had said in living memory. 14 civilizations received the signal. 11 acknowledged it and did nothing. This was not cruelty, it was calculation. The Drekhale had a well-documented absorption record, and no species with functioning self-preservation instincts wanted to place themselves between the consuming system and whatever it was currently eating. 2 civilizations sent resource packages, bundles of materials, medicines, and fabrication tools, launched from a safe distance unmanned. Generous in their way, useless in practice. The 14th civilization responded differently. The Vel'shara communication relay station on the outer edge of their system picked up the incoming transmission first. Counselor Wetherin, the youngest member of the Emergency Council, was on duty. He was 17 years old in Vel'shara terms, equivalent to roughly 32 human years, and he had not slept in 4 days. He was drinking something cold and bitter from a ceramic cup, watching absorption data scroll across his monitors, when the transmission came in. It was not tonal. It was structured in rigid sequential blocks, the galactic equivalent of plain text. Blunt. Almost rude by Vel'shara standards. He read it 3 times before he called Darasen. The message said, "This is Commander Alicia Voss, United Earth Coordination Force, Deep Response Division. Your signal was received 31 hours ago. We are already moving. ETA to your system, 19 days. We are sending 3 teams. Do not be alarmed by what you'll explain when we arrive. Start clearing your upper ocean corridors, if possible." Darasen read the message standing at the window of her chamber, watching the slow gray pulse of the absorbed zone moving across her world's ocean like a bruise spreading under skin. "Who are the humans?" Wetherin asked. "A young species," she said. "Land dwellers. Mammals. They've been spacefaring for less than 300 years. And they think they can help us? Daracen was quiet for a long time. They didn't ask if they could, she said. They just came. The Vel'shara spent those 19 days preparing for visitors who confused them completely. The second message came 4 days after the first. It was from someone named Chief Builder Dominic Reyes, and it contained a list of questions so specific and strange that the council spent 2 full days simply parsing them. What is the average salinity gradient between your thermal vent cities and your surface layer? What is the tensile strength of coral under sustained vibration? Do the Drekhale move faster in warmer or colder water? Have you observed any pattern in their absorption sequence? Do they start from edges or centers? Have they absorbed all materials on your planet? The Vel'shara answered every question. They were suspicious, but they answered. 5 days later, a third message arrived. This one came from someone with no title listed, only a name, Captain James Burr, 14th Demolition Engineering Battalion, and it said only, "Can you give me the structural maps of your 3 largest non-absorbed cities? I want to know what's holding them up." Elder Counselor Saven, the oldest member of the council, found this last message deeply unsettling. "They want to know how our cities are built," she said quietly. "And they are called a demolition battalion." "Perhaps demolition is their form of shelter," Daracen said. "That makes no sense. Neither does responding to a stranger's distress signal from 3 systems away," Daracen said. And yet here they are. The 19 days passed slowly. The Western Ocean continued to darken. 2 more cities were evacuated. A Vel'shara poet named Reenfal, who had refused to leave the city of Oranshal on principle. She had been documenting the absorption, she said, because someone had to, stopped transmitting on day 11. Her last recorded words, transmitted just before her signal cut out, were, "It doesn't hurt them to grow. That's the worst part. They don't know they're ending us. There is no malice here, only appetite." Those words circulated through every surviving Vel'shara settlement. They sat in the chest like swallowed stone. On day 19, 3 human vessels dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Shinvara system. They were nothing like what the Vel'shara expected. Vel'shara ships were long and tapered, designed for deep water pressure. Even in space, they still carried the memory of the ocean in their architecture. They were beautiful in the way old things are beautiful, shaped by a design philosophy that had evolved over centuries. The human ships were not beautiful. The first was a broad, flat-hulled vessel bristling with antennae and equipment banks, its exterior covered in what appeared, at least on visual scan, to be improvised additions, modules bolted to modules, and cables running externally along the hull, where there wasn't room for them inside. This was Commander Voss's ship, the UE Carrington. The second was larger, slower, and sat heavier in space. It was almost entirely cargo. Its designation was UE Threshold, and it belonged to Chief Builder Reyes. It did not look like a ship that had traveled between stars. It looked like something assembled from the inside of a warehouse and then somehow launched anyway. The third ship was small, swift, and darker than the others. It absorbed light in a way that made it difficult to look at directly. Its name, painted in small white letters on its hull, was UE Consequence. This was Captain Burr's ship. Wetherin looked at the 3 vessels on his long-range display and said, with enormous sincerity, "We might have made a mistake." Daracen said nothing. She was already opening a communication channel. Commander Voss's face appeared on the relay screen. She was a middle-aged human female, with short dark hair and tired eyes that came not from sleeplessness, but from years of solving problems without clean solutions. She looked at Daracen with calm attention. "Counselor," she said, "I'm sorry we couldn't come faster. Could you please show me what we're dealing with?" Daracen pulled up the absorption maps. She transmitted 19 days of progression data, population displacement numbers, city structural analyses, and everything the council had collected. Voss studied it without speaking for almost 3 minutes. Then she said, "Okay, Dom, you're seeing this?" A voice off-screen, Reyes said, "Already building a model." Burr. Another voice, quieter, more careful. "I see it." "Good," Voss said. She looked back at Daracen. "Here's what we're going to do. Alicia Voss did not pretend to understand the Vel'shara. She had read the briefing files on the transit over 18 days of dense anthropological notes compiled from the Galactic Ethnographic Archive, supplemented by what little direct contact records existed. She understood, intellectually, that the Vel'shara were an oceanic species, that their civilization was built on living architecture, that their concept of Kethforum made this moment, receiving help, one of the most difficult things a Vel'shara could experience. She did not pretend to fully grasp what that felt like. But she respected it. Her first conversation with Darasen lasted 4 hours. She did not spend that time explaining plans. She spent it asking questions, not like Reyes's questions, which were engineering-specific and precise, but broader questions. What did the Vel'shara value most? What did they want preserved, above all else? If they could save only one thing on Shinvara, what would it be? Darasen was surprised by the question. What does that have to do with stopping the Drekhail? Everything, Voss said. Because if I don't know what matters most to you, I might stop them and still destroy what you were trying to protect. I've made that mistake before. I'd rather not make it here. There was a long pause. Velmath, Darasen said quietly. The Western Ocean. It is where where our earliest memory lives. It is half consumed already, but if any of it can be preserved, then that's our priority anchor, Voss said. She wrote it down, physically, with a pen. Darasen noticed the phenomenon and found it strange, that a species capable of interstellar travel still pressed ink into paper, and then found it strangely comforting. Over the next 2 days, Voss established the coordination framework. She did not command the Vel'shara. She did not insert her people into Vel'shara decision chains. Instead, she built a bridge, a shared operational picture that both human and Vel'shara team members could access and update in real time, with a translation layer handling the tonal to sequential conversion so that nothing was lost between species. She assigned 2 of her own officers as full-time liaisons whose only job was to sit with Vel'shara council members and explain, in real time, what the human teams were doing and why, and to listen, genuinely listen, to Vel'shara objections and concerns, and relay them back immediately. The Vel'shara had expected a commander who would arrive and take over. What they got was a commander who set up a system where nobody had to take over because everyone could see everything at once. Elder Esaven watched this with deep suspicion for 48 hours. Then she said to Darasen, "She is not trying to lead us." "No," Darasen agreed. "She is trying to make it so we can lead ourselves, with more information than we had before." "Yes." Esaven was quiet. "That is a very specific kind of intelligence," she said at last. "I did not expect it from a land dweller." Dominic Reyes had the kind of mind that saw the world in materials. Not in a cold or reductive way, he genuinely loved materials. The way stone remembered pressure, the way metal fatigued and recovered, the way water found paths that rigid thinking never would. He had grown up in a city that flooded every monsoon season, and he had spent his childhood watching his neighbors respond, not with despair, but with a completely pragmatic creativity that impressed him more, looking back, than anything he'd been formally taught. He entered the water of Shinvara on the 3rd day after arrival, in a pressure suit designed for deep ocean environments, accompanied by 2 Vel'shara engineers who had volunteered to guide him. The Vel'shara were amphibious. They breathed both water and air, though they preferred water, and they moved through their cities with an ease that made Reyes feel like an enthusiastic tourist. He didn't mind. He was too busy looking at everything. The Veth coral was extraordinary. He had read the reports, but reading about it and being inside a building that was alive and shifted slightly under his hand and communicated structural stress through bioluminescent signals along its surface were completely different experiences. He stood in the main archway of the city of Shinterra, the largest non-absorbed settlement remaining, and watched the coral pulse gently with soft blue light, and he said, to no one in particular, "It knows we're here." One of his Vel'shara guides, a young engineer named Teal'von, said, "It remembers you. It has recorded your weight and your movement patterns. In 3 days, it will have adjusted the floor slightly to better support how you walk." Reyes stared at her. "The floor is going to customize itself to my footsteps?" "Only slightly. It is polite, not transformative." Reyes laughed, a sudden, loud laugh that made both Vel'shara guides recoil slightly from the sound. He apologized. They accepted. He laughed again more quietly. The problem he was trying to solve was this: the Drekhail absorbed by chemical contact. They extended a film of enzymatic material, the Vel'shara called it Vethkal, the gray hunger, across any surface they touched, and that film slowly broke down the molecular structure of whatever it contacted and converted it into Drekhail biomass. The Veth coral was particularly vulnerable because it was biologically active. The Drekhail's enzymes found the living coral easier to process than inert stone. The Vel'shara had tried coating structures with inert materials to slow absorption. It bought time, 2 to 3 days per coating application, but the Drekhail adapted, developed new enzyme profiles, and resumed absorption. Reyes looked at this problem for 6 days and then came to a conclusion that made his team think he had lost his mind. "We're not going to fight the absorption," he said. "We're going to use it." He pulled up his design on the shared operational screen. The Veth coral learns and adapts. That's why it's vulnerable, but it's also the most sophisticated biological material I've ever encountered. The Drekhail also adapt. What if we give them something that teaches them the wrong lesson? He had designed, working with Teal'von and the Vel'shara engineering team, a synthetic Veth structure from Veth coral extracts combined with compounds from the UE Threshold's fabrication stores that was biologically active enough to attract the Drekhail's enzymatic film but contained a deeply embedded molecular sequence that disrupted the Drekhail's conversion process. Not poison. Not a weapon. Something more subtle. A confusion signal. When the Drekhail absorbed the synthetic Veth, they would begin the conversion process, and then encounter molecular data that their system couldn't categorize. Not foreign enough to reject, not familiar enough to process. It would stall their absorption cycle, not permanently, but for long enough to matter. Long enough for what? Voss asked. Reyes nodded toward Burr's dark little ship, visible on the external display. Long enough for him to do his part, he said. James Burr did not like being called a bomber. He did not correct people who called him that because it would require explaining something that most people, human or otherwise, found difficult to follow. He was, technically, a demolition engineer. But demolition engineering, in the way Burr practiced it, had nothing to do with destruction. It had to do with sequence. Any structure, any system, had a load-bearing logic. Every element supported everything else, and everything supported itself. If you understood that logic, if you mapped it with enough precision, you could remove the right element at the right moment and cause a cascade that no brute force could achieve. The structure came apart along its own fault lines, guided by gravity and physics, without wasted energy. Burr believed this applied to everything. Buildings, organizations, ecosystems, biological systems. He had spent the 19-day transit studying every piece of data available on the Drekhail. Most species who had encountered the consuming system had tried to fight it at the expansion front, the active edge, where absorption was occurring. This was intuitive but wrong, Burr concluded. The expansion front was the newest, most adaptive part of the system. It was also the least integrated. Fighting there was fighting the organism's immune response. The Drekhail, like any complex system, had old tissue and new tissue. The oldest absorbed material, the original seed mass, the first Drekhail organisms from which the entire network had grown, was located somewhere in the deepest, most established part of the absorption zone. It was slower, denser, and more calcified. And, if his analysis was correct, it was the primary coordination node. The rest of the system didn't think for itself. It received signals from the core and propagated them outward. Cutting off those signals wouldn't kill the Drekhail. Burr was not trying to commit genocide against a consuming system. He wasn't even sure that was possible, and he wasn't sure it was right. What he was trying to do was interrupt the symphony. If he could get into the absorption zone, deep past the active front, through the confused and stalled territory that Reyes's synthetic Veth would create, and place a precisely calibrated disruption charge at the right depth, at the right angle, he could sever the signal pathways between the core coordination mass and the expansion front. The front would go dark. Without instructions, the active absorption organisms would not know what to convert next. They would slow, stall, and eventually the network would begin the resource-expensive process of re-establishing communication pathways, a process that, based on observed behavior of similar distributed biological networks, would take between 40 and 90 days. 40 to 90 days of stillness. Not a permanent solution. Burr was always honest about that. But 40 to 90 days of stillness was enough for Reyes to do something that had never been done before: build a barrier that the Drekhail couldn't adapt to, because it wouldn't feel like a barrier at all. The night before Burr made his descent into the absorption zone, Darasen found him sitting at the edge of the UE Carrington's observation deck, staring at the long gray scar the Drekhail had carved across the Western Ocean. She had not sought him out for any official reason. She was simply walking because Vel'shara sometimes walked when the weight of things became too much to sit with. She stopped beside him. "You're going into it tomorrow," she said. "Yes." "Are you afraid?" Burr considered the question seriously. He did not perform bravery or dismiss the fear. "A little," he said, "but mostly I'm thinking about the math. When I'm inside a problem, the fear gets quiet." Darasen looked at the gray mass moving slowly across Vel'math. "Our poet Reinfal said that the Drekhail feel no malice, that they simply hunger." She was right, Burr said. That's what makes them difficult. You can't negotiate with hunger. You can only change the landscape around it. Darasen was quiet for a long time. Then she said something she had not planned to say. "If something goes wrong tomorrow, if you do not come back, I want you to know that the Vel'shara will remember your name. We record the names of those who chose to stand in difficult places for us. It is one of our most sacred practices." Burr said nothing for a moment. Then, "What's the word for it?" "Vel'kethsera," she said. "It means, roughly, the root that holds even when the tree above it is gone." Burr looked at her. Then he looked back at the gray ocean. "That's a good word," he said. The UE consequence entered the absorption zone at 0340 local Shinvara time, when the bioluminescent organisms that lit the ocean's natural darkness were at their quietest. Burr piloted manually. His crew, 2 engineers and a systems specialist, ran the monitoring arrays and said almost nothing. They had worked with Burr long enough to know that he went somewhere internal before a job, and that the best thing to do was leave him there. The synthetic Beth deployment had begun 18 hours earlier. Reyes's teams, working in shifts, in 6-person crews, dropping fabricated Beth structures at calculated intervals along the absorption front, had successfully created a 3-kilometer corridor of confused absorption activity. The Drekhail in that zone were stalled. Their enzymes were firing, their conversion process initiated, but the molecular feedback was meaningless. They were trying to read a language that had no grammar. Burr navigated the consequence through that corridor. The visual outside the ship was unlike anything in his experience. The active Drekhail was a dark, moving mass, not one organism but a distributed membrane of billions of organisms, connected by enzyme threads thinner than silk. In the stalled zone, the movement was slower and uncertain. The membrane pulsed in irregular rhythms, searching for a signal it couldn't find. It was, Burr thought, deeply sad in a way he hadn't anticipated. Not sympathetic. He was not going to feel sorry for the thing consuming an entire civilization, but sad in the way that systems in distress are always a little sad. The consumption system was functioning exactly as it had evolved to. It was not evil. It was just ruinously misplaced. He had once demolished a 1,000-year-old building, a library, condemned and structurally unsound, that the city had decided wasn't worth saving. He had done the job correctly. The building came down precisely, with no damage to neighboring structures. And he had stood in the rubble afterward and felt the weight of everything that building had held in its walls: the people, the years, the accumulated weight of time. He had known in a clear and quiet way that doing the right thing and doing the painful thing were sometimes the exact same action. He felt something like that now. The consequence descended 400 meters below the absorption front, moving into the oldest tissue of the Drekhail network, the deep, slow mass of the original seed organism, calcified and dense, pulsing with the slow authority of a system that had been doing this for a very long time. "Coordinates confirmed," his systems specialist said quietly. "You're in the window." Burr placed the disruption charges manually. 3 of them are positioned at angles calculated to create the most efficient cascade through the signal pathways. The charges were not explosives in the conventional sense. Instead, they were acoustic and electromagnetic disruptors designed to create interference waves that would propagate through the biological signaling matrix of the core mass and interrupt its output without destroying it. He armed them. He set the 30-second timer. He began moving the consequence back up through the corridor. At second 18, the stalled zone membranes suddenly shifted. Brr. I see it. The Drekhail were not adapting. They were reorienting. The whole mass of the confused zone pivoting, the way a school of fish pivots in open water, a single coordinated movement that suggested the core was aware of the disturbance and was actively responding. The charges were fired at 30 seconds. For a long moment, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, nothing changed. Then the mass went still. Not slow, not confused. Still. The feeling was akin to a wave that had reached its pinnacle and lingered, suspended, until the decision to descend was made. The signal had been severed. Burr exhaled. Get us out of here, he said. Carefully. 43 days of stillness. That was what they got. In those 43 days, Dominic Reyes built something that had never existed before in the galaxy's recorded history, a living barrier. The concept was his, but the execution belonged to both species equally. Vel'shara biologists who had spent their lives studying Veth coral, its growth patterns, its electrical response architecture, and its capacity to store and replay molecular memory, worked alongside Reyes's fabrication teams to design a new structure. Not a wall, not a shield, a conversation. The barrier Reyes built was a continuous band of engineered Veth coral, 3 meters thick, running along the entire perimeter of the active absorption zone, that had been seeded with a specific and carefully designed molecular vocabulary. When the Drekhail's enzymes made contact with this barrier, they would not receive confusion. They would receive data. Specifically, they would receive data that replicated the signaling patterns of the core mass. The barrier would, in essence, tell the Drekhail's expansion front that the territory beyond it was already absorbed, already processed, already converted. There was nothing useful there. Whether the scheme would work long-term was genuinely unknown. The Vel'shara biologists debated it constantly. The Drekhail might adapt, learn the deception, and push through. But the barrier didn't need to work forever. It needed to work long enough for the Vel'shara to do what they had been doing for 3,000 years: adapt, rebuild, and make their world speak back. The construction ran around the clock. The ocean floor around Shantara glowed constantly with the work lights of the human fabrication teams and the natural luminescence of the Veth coral as it grew, directed by Vel'shara electrical signals and Reyes's structural guidance into shapes that were neither fully Vel'shara nor fully human, but something new, a collaboration written in living material. Wetherin worked the night shifts alongside Reyes's crew. He had volunteered formally, been accepted officially, and then showed up and made himself so quietly useful that everyone forgot he had ever needed to volunteer. He translated. He explained. He asked questions that helped the human engineers understand what the Veth was doing when it pulsed in unfamiliar patterns. One night, around day 30, Reyes looked at what they had built and then looked at Wetherin and said, "This is the most interesting thing I've ever made." Wetherin considered this. "It is not made," he said. "It is grown. There is a difference." "You're right," Reyes said. "This is the most interesting thing I've ever grown." Wetherin made the Vel'shara gesture for approval, a slow, deliberate closing and opening of the secondary eyelid, which translated roughly as, "I accept what you have said is true." Reyes did not know what the gesture meant, but he felt its warmth anyway. On day 38, something happened that no one had planned for. A Vel'shara monitoring team working near the edge of the newly completed barrier section in the northeastern quadrant reported an anomaly. The Drekhail mass in that section, still dormant, still signal severed, was showing unusual thermal activity. The anomaly did not exhibit the aggressive heat signature typically associated with resuming absorption. Something quieter. Teal'von, who had become the primary Vel'shara liaison to Reyes's team, brought the data to the Joint Operational Center. Everyone looked at it. Burr, who rarely attended these meetings, was there for reasons he couldn't articulate. He looked at the thermal pattern for a long time. Then he said, "It's not the whole mass. It's localized. A small cluster." A cluster doing what? Voss asked. No one had an answer. They sent a remote sensor drone, small, passive, and non-disruptive, to observe. The footage it sent back was not what anyone expected. A section of the Dracale mass, roughly the size of a house, had separated itself from the broader network. It was not absorbing anything. It was not expanding. It was sitting at the edge of the barrier and doing something that the sensor drone's analysis system could only categorize as repeated contact behavior, extending and retracting its enzyme film against the surface of the Veth barrier, over and over, in a pattern that had a rhythm to it. It's not feeding, Reyes said. No, Teal'c agreed. It's reading, Burr said. Everyone looked at him. The barrier is sending molecular data, he said slowly. Data that mimics the core signals. But this section is signal severed. It's been cut off from the core for 38 days. It's been isolated. And it's been sitting against a surface that is transmitting something that feels like communication. He paused, trying to understand what the barrier is saying. There was a long, careful silence in the room. Darasen arrived late, having been briefed on the way. She looked at the drone footage. She looked at the thermal data. She looked at the isolated cluster of the consuming system pressing itself gently against the living wall her people and the humans had built together. It is alone, she said. The word landed in the room with weight. It's a biomechanical consuming system, one of the human engineers said carefully. It doesn't. I know what it is, Darasen said. I also know what loneliness looks like. I watched 1.2 million of my people go silent in 17 days. She paused. Loneliness looks like reaching toward anything that makes sound. The room was very quiet. It was Wetharen, the youngest person in the room, an assistant who had no formal authority over anything, who said, Can we answer it? Reyes looked at Teal'c. Teal'c looked at Darasen. Can the vet transmit? Reyes asked. Not just the false core signal is different. Something we designed deliberately. Yes, Teal'c said slowly. But we do not know what to say. We don't have to say anything meaningful, Reyes said. We just have to say, stop. There is a border here. We are here. You have reached something that knows you are there. They spent 9 hours designing the transmission. It was not a threat. It was not a welcome. It was something more precise than either an acknowledgement. The signal conveyed the message, boundary recognized, in the molecular language used by the Dracale's internal communication system. Presence noted. No further passage. They transmitted it through the barrier section. The isolated cluster went still. Then, over the next 6 hours, it slowly withdrew. Not fleeing, not retreating in any panicked way. It moved with the careful deliberateness of an entity that had received a clear message and comprehended its meaning. It rejoined the dormant mass. No one knew what this meant. The scientists on both sides spent weeks arguing about it. Whether the Dracale had any form of cognition, any capacity for communication, or any internal state that resembled understanding, these were questions that would occupy researchers for years. But the barrier held. Day 43. The core mass began re-establishing signal pathways, exactly as Burr had predicted. The consuming system began to stir. It reached the barrier. And stopped. The human ships prepared to leave on day 61. The UE threshold had delivered everything it carried: fabrication materials, biological compounds, sensor equipment, and sat visibly lighter in orbit above Shinvara. Its cargo holds empty. The UE consequence had been repaired from the damage it had sustained in the absorption zone, 3 hull panels replaced, 2 sensor arrays rebuilt, and sat dark and small and ready. The UE Carrington was the last to power up its transit drive. The farewell was not a ceremony. The Vel'shara did not do ceremonies for outsiders because they were cold, but because ceremony was intimate, and intimacy was not offered quickly. What they offered instead was a Vel'Keth soul, a formal recording of names and deeds into the living Veth coral of the city of Shin'Tera, so that the building itself would remember. Rhea stood with Teal'c in the archway of the city while it was prepared. The city pulsed slowly around them, recording, adjusting, and remembering. It will carry your name for as long as this building stands, Teal'c said. That means as long as there are Vel'shara to maintain it, which we intend to be a very long time. Reyes nodded. He didn't trust himself to say much. He looked at the walls that had learned his footsteps and felt something he didn't have a clean word for, something between pride and grief and wonder. Darasen met with Voss for the last time in the Joint Operational Center, a space that was already being repurposed back into a Vel'shara navigation room, the human equipment carefully packed and catalogued. "I have a question," Darasen said. "Go ahead. Why did you come? I have read your species' history. You have not always responded to distress. You haven't always been like this." Voss was quiet for a moment. She chose her words carefully. "We haven't. That's true. We spent a long time only answering signals when there was something in it for us." She looked out at the ocean, the Vel'math, still scarred in the west, still gray along its wounded edge, but holding. "About 100 years ago, a lot of us decided that wasn't the kind of species we wanted to be. It was felt that the calculation required a change. We're still arguing about it, honestly. Not everyone agrees." She paused. "But when your signal came in, we all agreed we didn't need to debate it." Darasen looked at her for a long time. "Your species confuses me," she said. "We confuse ourselves," Voss said. Darasen made the Vel'Kethsoul gesture, slowly, deliberately, with the gravity of something that was not given lightly. "Commander Alicia Voss. Your name is in our walls now." Voss received the compliment without deflecting it, without false modesty, and without the human reflex to minimize. She simply said, "Thank you. I'll try to be worth it." Burr said his farewell to Shinvara from orbit, alone on the observation deck of the Consequence. He watched the planet turn slowly below him, its deep oceans, its wounded western sea, and the thin, bright line of the barrier his team had built glowing faintly with Veth bioluminescence, which is the natural light produced by Veth organisms, where it curved along the absorption zone's edge. He thought about the isolated cluster that had pressed itself against the barrier and tried to understand what was speaking to it. He thought about Reinfal, the poet who had stayed to document and gone silent. He hoped she had been right, that there was no malice. He thought it was probably the most honest comfort available. He thought about a route when the tree above it was gone. Then he went back to work, because there was always more work, and the work was what he knew how to do. 3 years later, the barrier held. It had been reinforced twice, once by a Vel'shara engineering team that had, in the intervening time, developed a deep expertise in synthetic Veth construction, and once remotely by Reyes, who had transmitted detailed fabrication plans from 18 light-years away after Teal'von sent him data showing a weak section in the northwestern curve. The Drek'hale had not breached it. They had tested it, regularly, persistently, with the patient authority of a system that had been expanding for 60 years and did not entirely believe in limits. But the barrier spoke back every time, in the language the Drek'hale's own biology used, and every time the expansion front withdrew. The Western Ocean, Vel'math, was being reclaimed. Slowly, carefully, with a precision that required both Vel'shara biological knowledge and the fabrication techniques Reyes had left behind, now taught in Vel'shara engineering institutions under a curriculum that had no name yet but was quietly becoming its own discipline. Students called it Vel Reyes informally, which was not an official term but which their professors allowed, because language grows where it grows. In the 3rd year, a Vel'shara research team published a paper transmitted across the Galactic Archive about the isolated Drek'hale cluster and its behavior at the barrier. The paper was cautious and precise, and careful not to overclaim. It documented the behavior, noted the thermal data, observed the withdrawal. It concluded with a question rather than an answer. If a system that consumes can also pause at a boundary and press itself gently against a wall that speaks, what does that suggest about the nature of systems we have categorized as beyond communication? We do not know. We offer the question as an inheritance to those who come after us. The paper was read by researchers across 43 civilizations. It was also read quietly and without comment by Commander Alicia Voss, who was by that point managing 3 simultaneous operations on 3 different worlds, and who still wrote with a pen. She filed the paper in a folder she kept for things she wasn't done thinking about. The folder was very full. On Shinvara, in the city of Shintera, In the archway where Dominic Reyes had stood and laughed too loud and felt the floor learn his footsteps, the Veth coral pulsed slowly with blue light, carrying its memory. It carried the weight of the humans who had walked through it. It carried their names. It carried the record of what they had built together, in 43 days of stillness, in a space between a consuming dark and everything worth keeping. The coral did not have language, but it had memory. And memory, the Vel'shara had always believed, was the only form of love that did not require the beloved to still be present. Somewhere in the deep water of the Western Ocean, in the part of Vel'math that had been reclaimed, cleaned, slowly, by Vel'shara bioremediation teams working in shifts, a new Veth colony had begun to grow. It had not been planted. It had simply started, the way living things do, in the space where conditions were finally right. It was very small. It was very new. It pulsed, in the dark water, with a light that had no audience and needed none.
End.